as usual, I find myself in 150% agreement with Jim. This is a process of, just listening to the last hour or so, it's a process of readjustment. And, you know, Niall, I studied history, not at university, but with my close friend Simon Sharma, which always makes Niall tremble. But, you know, I just think, I believe in cycles, and this is a cycle. And if we went back to 1820, China and India would be 50% of the world's GNP, which is where Goldman and Jim and his colleagues predict it will be again shortly. And it's just inevitable. We can do one of two things. You know, we can either kick the can down the road again and avoid the evil day, or we can adopt Niall's plan, but there's the third leg that has to take place, which he touched on, is that we have to get the structural inflexibility right. And that means pain the other way. It's going to be extremely unpleasant. I see that, you know, headline in the FT this morning, no-fault dismissal is now going to become the latest issue that Vince Cable falls out of agreement with the coalition. And it's going to be unpleasant that side too. So what do, you know, whilst all this conversation is going on if you're trying to run a business? And the answer is, you know, you do what we did this morning. You open up in Myanmar, for example. 66 million people, a mini Vietnam, or not so much a mini Vietnam, potentially as strong an economy as Vietnam, an opportunity, which is a mini China. On Friday, we acquired the leading digital agency in Russia, Grape. And that's what you have to do. So I'm totally in agreement with Jim. You have no choice. You know, ironically, pension funds look at companies, institutional investors look at companies on a quarterly basis. But ironically, we have a longer time view than politicians. Politicians are concerned about being, you know, they're in the business to be re-elected. And that's it. So if you're at the beginning of a 5-year term, or 40% into it, like the coalition here, you have a little bit more time to be flexible. If you're Obama in America, where you have an election every 2 years, because you have the midterm congressionals, you have very little room to maneuver if you want to stay in power, which is what it's all about. So we have to take, ironically, we have to take a much longer term view. And what am I trying to do with WPP? Well, you know, our strategy is new markets, so that's the BRICS and Next 11 and the CBITS and the MIST, however you want to define it. It's new media, it's what Google stands for, or whether we're talking about Facebook, or whether we're talking about Twitter, or whether we're talking about Apple or Amazon or whatever. It's about consumer insight, trying to figure out what the hell is going on in the consumer's mind. And lastly, to try and get our people, our 158,000 people in 107 countries, to work together in a more effective way. So I'm totally focused on that. In a way, I find these conversations depressing, distracting, and they're off strategy as far as I'm concerned. You know, you remember what Macmillan said? Macmillan said, events, dear boy, events, dear boy. When somebody said, you know, what's politics like, events. Now, a member of the government, the cabinet, said that to me exactly 4 weeks ago in response to the question is, why does the government not have a strategy? Events. Well, I mean, you know, if you're worried about the red tops and what the red tops are saying every morning, which is what they do worry about, the ministers, what do you expect?
Well, okay,
so I don't think you're just to be realistic about it.
But one classic political strategy, either side of the Atlantic, is no crisis tomorrow. That is the main thing that will often animate politicians.
Yep.
But are you saying, as a businessman, that you would rather Europe be plunged into chaos over the next 6 months?
No,
I'm serious, though. With the Greece leak, well, that is kind of what you're suggesting.
Let's take Niall's plan. Let's say, you know, I always look in these discussions for concrete proposals, and you very rarely get them. Let's take Niall's program. Let's, you know, Eurobonds et al. But there's a third leg. You know, I was just reading a Breaking Views before I came up, which is exactly follows now, well, not completely follows Niall's thesis or diagnosis, but then adds you have to deal with labour market inflexibility. It is high. You know, I'm not a great fan of Jean-Claude Trichet, but he has been consistent over the years before he left the ECB. He's been consistent about high unit labour costs being the problem, and there has to be a readjustment. We have to get more. You know, going back to your intro. whether it's the advertising industry, we think we're so wonderful here in London, and we think we're so wonderful in New York, and we traipse around the world, we go to festivals, and we tell all these people, and we call them emerging markets. They're not emerging markets. They've emerged. China is the second largest economy in the world. $7 trillion, $8 trillion. America's 15. Where are we?
But is the lesson of the last couple of years that someone like you, we ought to just tune out of Europe if we possibly can, or leave for that matter?
No, we have to.
And wait for 10 years until Jim O'Neill's all the solutions have all happened?
No, you have to look at it like Detroit looked at it a few years ago. The big three in Detroit, Ford did not take government money, but Ford got its act together under Alan Mulally, Jim Farley, Mark Fields. They all got their act together.
Anna was part
the other two companies, right, went into bankruptcy. To succeed in America, you have to go into Chapter 11. And you shore yourself of the healthcare liabilities and the pension fund liabilities. That's what you have to do. And you have to understand that it is an unpleasant adjustment. This is not, one statistic that always sort of amazed me. You remember when Apple had its problem with Foxconn and about cheap Chinese labor. And the Chinese government said, the compromise was Chinese workers will not work for longer than 49 hours a week. What was François Hollande elected on? 35-hour week in France. Tells you everything. Whether those are productive hours or they're unproductive hours, we have to adjust. We have to get our minds around the fact that we're not in the catbird seat. And by the way, I was thinking about that game of chicken. It reminded me of the Jimmy Dean film. I can't remember nobody in the room is old enough to remember this. But the James Dean film where they have the two cars, and you remember what happens in the chicken run, is that, not James Dean, he jumps out of the car, but the other guy gets his sleeve caught in the door, and he goes over the cliff. So there's always the danger, and I agree that this is a game of chicken. And Angela Merkel and the Germans have to take this position. They have to take this sort of front with the Greeks. I mean, it also reminded me a little bit about Chelsea's strategy against Bayern, the rope-a-dope strategy. It's the Muhammad Ali, I'm standing on the ropes, I get bashed about, I protect myself, and then I come out, I break out, and I score, or I win on penalties in that particular case. So the Greeks actually...
I wonder if there was anyone who came here today not knowing all about that game, because they will certainly find it very mystifying. But they blooming well ought to know about that game.
No, well, there would be something worldwide.
But do you think... there'll be a lot of people in this room who actually think, a little bit similar to what Jim was saying, that this is, what governments do and these nice headlines about these nice figures, Chancellor Merkel and François Hollande, is not actually central to what they do anymore and not central to the direction, certainly of the global economy, because what's actually happening is that people are succeeding despite their national economies rather than because of them. Is there an element of that in your business, or do you feel...
No, I just think it comes down to very, I'm sort of simple in my thinking, it's not complicated. For anybody to believe that 1.3 billion people in China or 1.1 or 1.2 billion people in India can't produce better advertising agencies or research companies or identity companies or PR companies than 60 million people in the UK or even 300 million people in the US is living in a dream world. Over time, that is going to happen. For 200 years, history has been against China or India. Maybe it may not be in the next 200 years. It's going to be a favorite. And by the way, all this stuff about America, Diana was right. A couple of years ago, the Europeans look at America and said, they got us into this mess, right? But here again, we're here between Bear Stearns and Lehman now. A lot of people believe that what's going on now is just a forerunner to another September 2008 crisis with Lehman. My biggest worry, actually, is not about Europe or Western Europe. By the way, there's one other thing. Be quite clear, Western Europe and Eastern Europe are two totally different things. Germany, Poland, and Russia, the same way the world is moving eastwards, I believe Europe is moving eastwards. And the center, and this raises lots of political issues, the axis, and I use that word advisedly, the axis of Germany, Poland, and Russia is an extremely powerful one. Jim's statistic about Russian GNP is absolutely on the money. Putin faces, I think, the issue of trying to deal with the regional integrity of Russia. It's not about the demonstrations in Red Square. Those are quotes unquote friendly demonstrations. It's about maintaining the regional integrity of the republics, because they, don't ask me why, but I was in Tatarstan a few weeks ago, and they give 78% of their local revenues to Moscow. And the President and Prime Minister of Tatarstan spends more time in Moscow trying to get the money back than anything else. So think about it. And I think the issue is in America, because I think after the election, they will be unable to kick the can down the road. I personally think, this personal view, Obama will get re-elected, although the polls are starting to tighten up, but we'll have gridlock. The Republicans will control the House or the Senate or both. And so the problem is that you get into that gridlock situation, and then they'll have to come up with some form of Simpson-Bowles solution. They won't be able to kick the can down the road inevitably. I was at the, sorry to say this, the Microsoft conference last week, and there was a lot of gloominess about that particular issue post the election.
We're going to finish up in a minute. Just to take us back to where we started, various stories about people searching for the drachma symbol again on their keyboards. Is that something that internally you're preparing for?
Yeah, so
not having a euro?
We sweep every night. We sweep every night. The Telegraph was slightly inaccurate on a number of things. We're not moving to Singapore. It's amazing how journalists actually seek to sensationalize.
Hang on, how is that the answer to? Do you
expect? No, because they also I wanted to get that one in. They also said that we move our money into stronger currencies out of the euro. That's not quite true, but we do sweep every night to protect ourselves.
Sorry, so when you say sweep, you mean make sure that you haven't got any outstanding positions on the euro that will get you in trouble.
That's right. So essentially, we've taken that sort of action to try and.
But in a year's time, do you think 17 countries will still be in the eurozone?
I still feel that we don't know what the implications are of Greece pulling out. I still think it is a game of chicken. I still think there will be some resolution, and that the Germans will ante up. It looks to me that this is sort of similar to West Germany buying East Germany. It's unpleasant in the short term, but in the longer run, it's to the Germans' benefit. I mean, who's benefited from the euro? The Germans. They're a free-floating mark. They would have been priced out of the export markets. So I just think at the end of the day, their self-interest will prevail. And you said, you have to choice between price stability or this. I think we'll go for this.
So Martin Sorrell, thank you very much.